this stage. Welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon and good evening to people from around the world. For those who've joined, who are just audience, may I please ask you to mute and to also turn off your video at this stage. Welcome to a webinar put forward by the Early Prevention of Obesity in Childhood collaboration and the Transforming Obesity Prevention for Children collaboration. This one is entitled Early Prevention of Obesity in Childhood, Moving the Field Forward Through Collaboration. Next slide, please. As I begin, I would like to acknowledge country. All of the presenters and many of the audience, but not all, are from Australia, and we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which we are presenting and all the lands from which you are viewing this webinar. Thank you. Next slide, please. We have three wonderful young early career researchers who are presenting some work that is very high quality. Annalena Seidler, or Lena, is a research fellow in the NHMRC Clinical Trials Centre at the University of Sydney and editor of the Cochrane Prospective Meta-Analysis Group. Dr. Brittany Johnson is a postdoctoral research associate at the Caring Futures Institute at Flinders University in Adelaide in Australia. And Kylie Hunter is an early career researcher also from the NHMRC Clinical Trials Centre at the University of Sydney and editor of the Cochrane Prospective Meta-Analysis Methods Group. I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Louise Bauer. I'm a chair of Child and Adolescent Health at the University of Sydney and I work at the Sydney Children's Hospitals Network, and I'm President-elect of World Obesity Federation and Director of the NHMRC Early Prevention of Obesity in Childhood Centre of Research Excellence. I'm really delighted to have this happen here. Now, just to let you know, shortly we will be able to give you the Slido information that you can get up. So make sure you've got your phone, your iPad ready for when that happens, and we'll use that to poll people. Please use the chat function for asking questions. And we will try to answer those at the end. We'll have three speakers speak in succession, and I will now hand over to Lena to start. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. And I would like to start by acknowledging many of our collaborators and the key funding that has supported this work, mainly the NHMRC in Australia. Most of what we're doing and what we are presenting on today is all about bringing researchers together. And over again, we find that the whole is so much more than the sum of its part. So thank you all for collaborating with us and for making all of this happen. So I'd like to acknowledge the EPOCH collaboration that started in 2009. And at the top, you can see one of the early pictures of the EPOCH collaboration, which resulted in the largest prospective meta-analysis in this field to date, and I will present the findings on that later on today. I'd also like to acknowledge the EPOCH Centre for Research Excellence, which is led by Louise Bauer, and which we're extremely grateful to. The EPOCH-CRE meetings are actually where the three of us met and started talking to each other and started getting really excited about each other's research and the methodologies we're using, and decided to bring these methods together to answer research questions. And you can actually see the three of us in the bottom picture. Brittany with the yellow hair right at the front, and me right behind her, and then Kylie right at the very bottom of the stairs down here. So we are very grateful to the CRE and to the EPOCH collaboration. And this collaboration has ultimately led us to apply for a competitive grant to bring together the Top Child collaboration. And again, we will talk about Top Child more depth later, but I would like to take this opportunity to thank the many incredible researchers that are part of this collaboration and that are passionate about addressing early childhood obesity in collaboration. And I'm handing over to Britt.
Thanks, Lena. So before we go any further, we just wanted to recap what we do and don't know about early child obesity prevention interventions at the moment. So we know that helping babies to learn healthy behaviours in the early years can set them up for a lifetime of good habits and prevent obesity. and the interventions for families of young children can help to support parents around these behaviours. And in fact, there's been a large number of trials tested around the world to date. But these interventions are often complex. So they're often a one-size-fits-all approach, target multiple different behaviours, include lots of information over a number of sessions, and don't always reach those families that need them most. What we don't know is which parts of these interventions are most important for families, and if different types of families need different parts of these interventions. We also know that systematic reviews and meta-analyses are really important for informing policy and practice, and that individual participant data meta-analyses can provide us with an even greater depth of information, and we'll speak to what this means in a little bit later. But as I mentioned, there's a number of trials that have already been undertaken or are currently planned or ongoing in this field. So there's a wealth of information already out there that we can learn from to understand the complexity of these interventions and to really work together to address the behaviour change required for early obesity prevention. So what do we mean by sort of unpacking this complexity? I thought I'd get my Duplo out from when I was a kid to help sort of visualise and explain this. So this first photo is showing you what we sort of see when we pull together interventions at the moment. They're all mixed up and there's lots of different parts and we're not really sure which parts are effective or not. But what we're going to do is apply a unique combination of methods so that we can really start to understand what these interventions are made of. So using systematic approaches to unpack the elements of these interventions. So looking at pulling apart the information and strategies that are provided to families and also how these interventions are delivered. Then we can sort of see all of these essential building blocks that these interventions are made up of. We can then combine that with individual participant data, and this is where we can start to really explore which parts of these interventions are most effective and for who they're most effective for, so that we can then design these tailored new interventions, so that we're just including those most important or most effective essential building blocks, which can help these interventions be delivered at scale, but also have the opportunity to tailor different types of interventions to different family types so that we can best support families to prevent obesity and set up these healthy habits early in life. So just a quick overview of today's webinar. We don't have a lot of time, so we're going to cover a lot of content. Firstly, we're going to provide a bit of a taster of some of the innovative knowledge synthesis methods that we have available to date. We're going to provide some examples of how we've applied these methods in early childhood obesity prevention in Australia and New Zealand. And then we're going to introduce you to the Top Child collaboration and how we're moving this work to that sort of global scale. And then we'll finish with those questions at the end. So if you have questions as we go along, feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. So this is our first little Slido poll. So if you have your smartphone handy or want to jump onto the web browser, you can type in slido.com and the hashtag TopChild, or if you just scan the QR code. So if you jump into that, we've had lots of practice with scanning QR codes here in Australia with all the COVID check-ins lately. So hopefully everyone's familiar with that using the camera function on your phone. And if you can just answer the poll, which aspect of the webinar you're most excited about today. You can actually select multiple responses if you like as well. There seems to be lots of interest in the methods. Not too many tricky questions, hopefully. All right, wonderful. We might leave it there. Feel free to keep polling because we'll check this out at the end to see what you were most interested in hearing more about. Now I'll pass over to Lena to cover the next part of the presentation.
Thank you, Britt, and thanks everyone for participating in our first poll. There will be more polls, so keep the tab open and the new questions will come up automatically. And in fact, the next poll is not going to be a poll, but a quiz to test some of your knowledge and how well you're listening to me now. So keep your ears open. So there are a range of methodologies available that can enhance what we can learn through evidence synthesis processes. And today I'm going to give a brief introduction to PMI's IPDs And Britt's going to give an introduction to intervention coding. So I'm going to talk about next generation evidence synthesis approaches, mainly individual participant data meta-analysis and prospective meta-analysis. But first, I'd like to give you some background on why we need these next generation approaches. As you all know, systematic reviews and meta-analyses are very important. They're widely regarded as at the top of the evidence hierarchy, and they're widely used to inform healthcare policy and practice. However, there are severe limitations and potential sources of bias associated with these traditional methods. And I will talk about some of those now. Firstly, systematic reviews and meta-analyses can be affected by publication and selective reporting bias. And they describe the phenomenon that positive results are more likely to be published and thus included in systematic reviews and meta-analyses, as you can see in this meme here. Secondly, we have the problem of retrospective inclusion of studies, which may influence which studies systematic reviewers end up including. So the knowledge of the study's results at the start may influence hypothesis and selection criteria, because most people doing systematic review actually know their field quite well, so they may already know what's out there before starting their review. And this can lead to meta-analyses on the same topic, sometimes reaching conflicting conclusions because they use different eligibility criteria. And I like to explain this problem with the example of Julie's daughter, who knew that she had failed history when she decided to exclude all minor subjects, which include history, from her evidence synthesis, and came to the conclusion that she is a straight A student. So the prior knowledge of the studies out there made her exclude the worst one and come up with a very brilliant result. Another problem associated with traditional meta-analyses is that often we are trying to compare pears with apples. So studies may have been conducted in different populations, collect different outcome measures, or collect the same measures but at different time points. And I think this is a particular problem in early childhood obesity prevention because there are so many different ways of measuring the same thing. So two studies that both want to measure weight as an outcome. One study may measure BMI at 2 years of age, the next study BMI Z-score at 12 months of age, and the third one prevalence of obesity or overweight at 3 years of age. And this can make evidence synthesis difficult and sometimes even impossible. The last problem I briefly want to talk about is the limitation to aggregate data in traditional systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So we have these really colorful populations, as you can see here on the right-hand side, and they get synthesized into publications. So the average effect estimates get pulled, a lot of information gets lost, and then as systematic reviewers, we are limited in our analysis in what can be extracted from these publications. So often we come up with a gray average effect estimate and a gray person here. And that means we can't really look at subgroups and we may lose a lot of information. Luckily, there's a solution to all these problems, and it's called next generation systematic reviews. And if you don't believe me, maybe you believe eminent Ion Needers, who also writes about these methods. And today I'm mainly talking about prospective meta-analysis and individual participant data meta-analysis, but if you are interested in the other methods, I'm happy to answer questions on them later on. So let me start with what a prospective meta-analysis is. The key feature of prospective meta-analysis is that studies are identified as eligible for inclusion before their results are known. So if you look at the diagram below here, there are 3 studies, and a prospective meta-analysis will be including them when they are in their planning stage, in their recruitment stage, or in their data collection stage, as long as the studies are included before the analysis stage, so before the results are known. And one of the key advantages of prospective meta-analyses is that they allow studies to agree on collecting the same core outcomes, so they can use the same instruments and the same time points. So what we can do is we can transform pears and apples into apples and apples. This also allows studies to agree on collecting rare but important outcomes that they may not have had the power and may not have looked at individually, but when combining their data, you do have enough power to analyze these outcomes. Importantly, harmonization does not require that studies follow exactly the same protocols. They can still do their own thing, they can still look at locally relevant questions, but the idea is to agree on some common core features. So just to give you a quick overview of the main differences between a prospective meta-analysis and a retrospective meta-analysis. Prospective meta-analysis are less biased because of the inclusion of studies before their results are known, publication and selective outcome reporting bias are reduced. They're more harmonious because we can harmonize outcomes and so on. They're more powerful because we have more power by combining studies. And importantly, they're collaborative. So researchers are working together instead of competing, which I think is a really great feature. Let me now talk to you about IPD meta-analysis. In an individual participant data meta-analysis, data from each individual study is collected. So we're looking at row by row data for each participant rather than just the aggregate publications. So now we're getting all the colorful people here and all their data and can look at much richer analyses. For example, we can now look at whether treatments or intervention effects may be different for the red and the purple little people compared to the blue people. So there's a lot more we can do with individual participant data. And for this reason, IPD meta-analyses are regarded as the gold standard for meta-analysis. They give you the most comprehensive and current data. They allow a verification of previous analyses and findings. And they also allow some harmonization across studies. For example, if studies use different cutoffs for dichotomizing outcomes with IPD, you can actually harmonize these cutoffs. Importantly, and I think that's really important for the work we're talking about today as well, they allow subgroup analyses that are not subject to ecological bias. So we can, with the example of child obesity, we can look at, for example, disadvantaged populations or culturally diverse populations and look at whether different interventions are effective for these types of populations. Importantly, all these approaches I've just talked about are collaborative approaches. Such as with the EPOCH collaboration, they involve researchers coming together and working together rather than just looking through papers and extracting data from them. And that is a very beautiful feature of these approaches because they really allow lots of different experts in a field to come together and answer big research questions together. We have published quite a bit of work on these methods. So we have published a guide to prospective meta-analysis that takes you through these approaches step to step. We've also written a Cochrane editorial on Cochrane's role in these methodologies and how all these methodologies fit into traditional systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So check them out if you'd like to know more.
Thanks, Lena. So there's also several different taxonomies and ontologies available to understand interventions and their components. So these provide a transparent way for reporting interventions in those sort of publications, but also provide us with a common language for when we come to synthesizing evidence in some of those methods that Lena spoke about of different forms of systematic reviews. So what you can see on the slide are some of those taxonomies to understand the behaviour change content of interventions. So things like the behaviour change technique taxonomy that looks at the smallest reproducible components or those active ingredients of interventions. And on the other side of the slide, these are some of the checklists and ontologies that look at those delivery features. So the sort of who, what, when, where, how of an intervention being delivered. So things like the tidier reporting checklist that we can also use to understand sort of common areas in interventions, and a series of ontologies that are currently under development by the Human Behaviour Change Project in the UK. They're looking at things like who's delivering the intervention and some of those ways in a more structured format. And we're going to be pilot testing some of those in Top Child as well. So watch this space for more. All right, so we're now up to the quiz that Lena pre-warned you about. So again, if you jump onto Slido, it should sort of automatically refresh, or if you've closed the browser, feel free to grab back out your phone and scan this one. So we have 3 quick questions to test some of the abbreviations that we've been using.
And it does show your name. So if you don't want your real name to come across, you can use a fake name.
Yeah, so there's a leaderboard at the end to see who sort of does the best in this little mini quiz, but hopefully it's a little bit of fun. But it's lovely to see your names of who's out there listening as well. Okay, so we've got the first question looking at what IPD stands for.
And we may have felt a little bit silly putting some of those together because it's very close to Christmas.
I think if we move on to the next question. Oh, very good success rate. So IPD stands for individual participant data. So the next one is looking at what BCT stands for. Sorry, I think we jumped ahead there. Feel free to keep answering that one. And if we now show the answer. Again, pretty good. So it is something we're using to understand that complexity, but it stands for behavior change technique. And on to our last question. So what is a PMA? Everyone was quick on this one. So if we reveal the answer, 100%. So a prospective meta-analysis. Well done, everyone.
We made it too easy.
Most people in this world don't know what a prospective meta-analysis is, so we have a very smart audience.
Thank you, Alison. And well done, Katie, the quickest to answer those. So for the next part, we're going to move into talking about some of the examples of how we've applied these methods. And given the fact that we don't have a lot of time and we could spend an hour talking about each of these projects, we're just going to give you a bit of a brief overview of the project and some of the key findings, but both of these projects have been published as well. So we'll provide some details of where you can find more information from those. So I'll hand over to Lena to start to talk about the next one.
Yes, and again, we'd like to acknowledge the project team who have worked on this over many years and the co-authors of this work that has now been published in Pediatric Obesity. So again, I will only be able to give you a brief snapshot, but please check out the paper if you'd like to know more. So the EPOCH PMA was the world's first individual participant data with prospective meta-analysis in early childhood obesity prevention. And it brought together 4 trials in Australia and New Zealand with over 2,000 mother-child diets in total. They were all face-to-face behavioral interventions, which started in pregnancy or within the first 6 months after birth. And as you can see in this forest plot on the right-hand side, whilst the interventions differed in their effectiveness, overall we found a moderate reduction in BMI-Z score at 2 years of age. And in addition to this moderate reduction, we found a longer duration of breastfeeding, a reduction in TV viewing time, and a reduction in some undesirable feeding practices. And one thing I'd like to show you briefly is how the decision to collaborate in a prospective meta-analysis actually influenced the outcome collection of the 4 EPOCH trials. Because the 4 trials actually all obtained independent funding and were planned independently, but then they all met at a conference and learned about each other and decided that they should work together and collaborate. So in this table here, you can see on the left-hand side the number of trials that collected each of the core outcome categories, or that were planning on collecting these outcome categories before they learned about each other. And as you can see, a lot of the outcome categories would have only been collected by maybe 1, 2, or 3 of the trials. However, after the decision to collaborate in a prospective meta-analysis and working together to agree on common core outcome categories, the majority of the categories were collected by all trials. So our availability of outcomes to meta-analyze for all trials went from only 18% if they hadn't decided to collaborate in a prospective meta-analysis to over 90%. And I think that really shows us how powerful these methods can be. However, even after completing this amazing study, some evidence gaps remain. Firstly, all these early obesity prevention interventions are complex and they do differ in their effectiveness. And we don't really know what's in them. So the interventions are black box, they're very complex, they go over a long time. We don't really know their internal workings and how they may work to reduce childhood obesity. And we had a limited ability to conduct subgroup analysis in the study because of the relatively small number of studies.
Thanks, Lena. So I guess from those evidence gaps that Lena just spoke about, this led us to do the next project. So this was actually the first project that brought together a lot of the steering group for Top Child. So the top picture shows several of our steering group members. And it was the first project that Kylie, Lena and myself worked on and sort of brought these methods together. And as you can see from the other picture on the slide, that this has now been published in Pediatric Obesity. So just like to acknowledge the broader project team and all of the co-authors of this project as well. But you can read the paper for all the full details. So the purpose of this project was sort of twofold. So we had 2 different objectives and methods. So the first was really to deconstruct those 4 EPOCH trials that Lena spoke about. So really to understand what are the target behaviours they're looking at, how are these delivered, and what are the behaviour change techniques they include. And we did that using some of those methods I spoke about earlier. On the other side, we looked at identifying intervention lessons from both the intervention facilitators and also the principal investigators from those 4 EPOCH trials in Australia and New Zealand. And we did this using semi-structured interviews. So this is a very quick taster of the results. As I mentioned, there's a lot more in there, but the main thing I wanted to highlight was really the variation that we found in intervention content. So you can see there was a range of different target behaviours. Delivery features changed in the format of sort of what way they were presented, what the setting was, the dose and the level of tailoring. And there was a big variation in the number of behaviour change techniques. So a total of 35 of the possible 93 behaviour change techniques were identified across all of the studies. But something that's really important to note is that by coding the unpublished intervention material, so as well as coding publications, we looked at participant handbooks and intervention facilitator manuals and things like that. And we were able to identify over double of the behaviour change techniques in the reported publications. So it really highlights that by collaborating and sharing those materials, we can gain a lot more information about these trials. And from the interviews, again, there's sort of a lot of results on the slide here, but essentially the key themes are around planning. So looking at having that collaboration and being mindful of scale up. Looking at being flexible with delivery modes and having that tailoring ability. When it came to evaluation, it was really looking at that reach and trying to support those families that might not access these interventions. And then when thinking about that implementation, it's really looking at those minimal effective interventions, or essentially what we're trying to achieve by combining these different methods together as well. And you can see Kylie and Lena on the slide here having lots of fun at their first time coding qualitative interviews as well. So there were a few remaining gaps from this project, and this was primarily limited to the fact that we had 4 trials in 1 geographical region. So we didn't have a large number of trials to look at, and we were unable to determine that effectiveness of different components. And because there was sort of such a variation in the number of techniques and things like that across different trials, we really can't determine which parts are most effective or explore any of those subgroups with this smaller number. But what we did learn is we formed a series of key recommendations for future interventions. So again, there's sort of more explanation of all of these, but from combining these two different methods, some of the key themes that came out were around that collaboration, looking at the feasibility and how we can implement these at scale, those minimal effective interventions, and really looking at how we might deliver these interventions and adapt them to different target groups. And a lot of these points are things that we're taking forward into the top child collaboration. So before I hand over to Kylie to introduce you to the Top Child collaboration, we thought we'd do one last little bit of engagement with the Slido. So again, if you want to jump on and answer this next point. So what's your favourite aspect of collaboration? You'll notice from what's popping up, it's a word cloud as well. So if something you think is extra important, put it in even if somebody else has. It's fantastic. So many great suggestions coming up. And I think that's a lot of these points are exactly why we really like collaborating on projects like these.
It's really nice to see how we're all on the same page on this.
I'll now hand over to Kylie to introduce the next section.
Thanks, Brett. I just saw someone put Christmas miracles. I like that one. So I'm very happy and, to be honest, a little relieved to be here, given that my computer decided to crash briefly before I was due to join. But sorry, I do apologise. I was a few minutes late. But it is my great pleasure to introduce the Top Child collaboration, and this stands for Transforming Obesity Prevention in Children, for children. Sorry. So this collaboration spawned from the foundational work we had been involved with as part of the EPOCH-CRE. So essentially, we wanted to address the evidence gaps that we had identified, and we'd also become aware of several emerging early obesity prevention trials. So we scribbled down some ideas on this whiteboard shown here and decided to expand our methodological approach to a global scale and utilise this broad network of experts that we had worked with during EPOCH. So the Top Child collaboration aims to bring together all planned, ongoing and completed early childhood obesity prevention trials from around the world to address the evidence gaps we had discovered during EPOCH and to transform the thinking and practices around early childhood obesity prevention. And as Lena mentioned, the collaboration is supported by a highly competitive Australian Government Ideas Grant, which we were very excited to obtain since only 11% of applications were funded and Top Child was among the top 5%. So our overarching aim is to determine which intervention components are most effective and for whom. So to do this, we will follow the process outlined. Bless you. We will follow the process outlined in this flow chart, which I will now briefly explain. Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah, this one. Thanks, Lena. So as the first step, we set out to form the collaboration. So to do this, we conducted systematic searches of medical databases and trial registries to look for eligible trials. So eligible trials included that needed to be randomised controlled trials evaluating parent-focused behavioural interventions, the primary aim of preventing childhood obesity and starting antenatally or within the first year after birth. So our search retrieved over 7,000 records, and after screening we had identified 65 eligible trials with a total of more than 50,000 eligible participants. So their combined statistical power is large. So the 65 eligible trials are set in 20 countries as shown in this map. So they are primarily in the USA, which is listed as a recruitment country for 33 out of the 65 eligible trials. Europe and UK have 21 trials, and Australia and New Zealand have 8 trials between them. So while trials are mostly recruiting in high-income countries, there are also some lower and upper middle income countries such as India, China, Guatemala and Brazil. So next we plan to undertake 2 concurrent projects, and for both of these we have prepared detailed protocols which we will be submitting to BMJ Open tomorrow, and we have obtained ethics approval already for both of these. So the first of these projects is an individual participant data meta-analysis with a nested prospective meta-analysis. And I'll explain a bit more about the nested EMA later. So I am leading this project as part of my PhD. After 11 years of working in research, this project came along and I decided this was the perfect opportunity to pursue a PhD on a topic that I really am passionate about, and with the support of such a fantastic team. So the first step for the IPD meta-analysis, we need to obtain obviously the raw data from trial representatives. And then the main aims of this are to evaluate the effectiveness of the interventions overall. And our primary outcome is BMI Z-score at age 24 months. And secondly, we want to conduct subgroup analyses of individual level characteristics, such as socioeconomic position, ethnicity and age, but also as well as trial level characteristics. So, for example, mode of intervention delivery and timing of intervention onset. So the second project is the Deconstructing Interventions project, and this is led by Brittany Johnson. So for this, we will request that trial representatives provide their unpublished intervention materials, because as Britt explained, this is crucial because a majority of behaviour change techniques, or more than double, were identified using these unpublished materials in our pilot work. So these materials will be coded into, with the main aims to characterise the interventions into their target behaviours, delivery features, and behaviour change techniques, or BCTs. And then secondly, we aim to explore the BCTs used to target these behaviours and the effectiveness of intervention components. So we will then create a combined data set, including data from both of these projects. And to our knowledge, this is the first time these 2 innovative methodologies have been combined. And then the combined data set from these projects will be used to conduct predictive modelling, and with the final result being effective, efficient and population-specific interventions that can be translated into policy and practice. Now, of course, this project would not be possible without the support and expertise of all our collaborators, and they are shown here in this organisational chart. So at the top we have the chair, so the collaboration is led by Lena, or Annalena Seidler. And we also, as you can see on the left, we have a stellar group of advisors. So they comprise internationally renowned experts across a broad range of fields, from evidence synthesis, behaviour change, obesity prevention, statistics, economics, policy, and so on. We also have 2 consumer representatives. So one is a nurse and was an intervention facilitator for one of the included trials. And we also have a parent representative. And then of course we have all our trial representatives. You can see it's quite a global group, and we are very grateful that they have already contributed their expertise in the development of both of our protocols, and we are hoping to grow this group as we go on. So next, I'll just briefly talk about 2 key things in regard to the timeline. So we plan to have an initial cutoff for data collection to be included in the first or the primary cycle of analyses of around May next year. However, we will be updating our searches annually and add new data into subsequent analysis cycles as it becomes available. And we also plan to hold annual collaborator meetings. And of course, ideally, these would be face-to-face because we'd love to meet you all, but at least in the near future, they'll probably be virtual. And these meetings will be to discuss analysis plans, results interpretations, publications, and so on and so forth. So next I wanted to show a brief status update of the Top Child collaboration to date. So yeah, so we have identified 50 eligible trials that we anticipate will have their data available by May 2021 for the first analysis cycle. And so the figure on the left shows that 31 of these 50 trials have already agreed in principle to share their data to date. And of these 31 trials, they include more than 30,000 participants, or 88% of available data. So we're very excited that this will make it the largest IPD meta-analysis in this field to date. But you may be wondering, what about the 15 or so planned ongoing trials that won't contribute to this first cycle of analyses? So these will be included in a nested prospective meta-analysis, or PMA. So this enables us to include all of the retrospective evidence that has been collected to date, but also harness the benefits of prospective meta-analysis methodology so that we can integrate emerging prospective evidence. So as Lena described, this is particularly beneficial for harmonising outcome collection, which can be an issue, particularly in this field, given the wide variety of measures that can be used to assess diet, physical activity, and weight, for example. So together with our collaborators, we plan to agree on a core outcome set and pre-specify preferred measures that ongoing studies will be encouraged to collect where possible. And so harmonising outcome collection in this way will facilitate data synthesis, which will make our job a little bit easier, and enhance statistical power to detect effects both overall and by subgroups. So lastly, I'm going to summarise the expected knowledge gains from Top Child. Next slide, please. So at the completion of this project, we will have an in-depth understanding of the effectiveness of early obesity prevention trials overall and by subgroups. We'll also have an in-depth understanding of behavioural components and delivery features used in early childhood obesity prevention interventions. And we will have identified effective intervention components overall and by subgroups. And this is very nicely demonstrated by Britt's Duplo display in this photo. So this evidence can be used to inform development and implementation of effective and efficient interventions. And lastly, we will have curated a world-first database of early obesity prevention interventions from around the world. Back to you, Britt.
Thanks, Kylie. So just to summarise, a bit quickly, thanks, Lena. So we're combining both our experience in these innovative knowledge synthesis or evidence synthesis methodologies, as well as our learnings from using these collaborative projects in Australia and New Zealand to really bring together both of these aspects in the Top Child collaboration and to really take this at a global level. So you might have seen from the chat the details for our website, but if we just skip to the next slide. You'll also see, this is just a screen grab of our website, but the website's up the top there. So feel free to check that out. It's got all of our publications and a news tab where you can keep updated in different things and where this recording will also go. But if you are an intervention facilitator and you think, or a trialist, and you think your trial might be eligible or you might have missed our emails, feel free to send us an email as well and we can check that eligibility.
Thank you very much.
No worries. So we just got a couple of key references, but as I mentioned, these are on the website. So I'll hand back to Louise now for questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Brittany, Britt, Lena and Kylie for an excellent and very well organised presentation. Please, we've already got a few questions up there. I know I've done a couple of them, but I thought they were very good. But we're open to comments from people. One of the questions that came up from Alison Hayes, who's a health economist, is when you're busy trying to get people to, when you're deconstructing intervention components, how practical would it be for trialists to catalogue resource use in delivering their individual interventions? She then says, I think you know where this question is going, and it's going immediately, of course, to the costs of interventions, trialists, delivery, the time it takes for delivery people to do things, and so on. So all of which are important in working out costs of an intervention. Would one of you like to comment on that sort of health economic aspect of it?
I can have a go starting. So yeah, great question. I think really what we're trying to do with this project is a huge amount of work, and with the number of trials that we're dealing with. So we'd love to do so many things, such as looking at the cost of these interventions. And I think that's something with some more funding we'd love to explore. But I guess at the moment, we're sort of limited to more understanding the components of these interventions, and with the hope that if we have these minimal effective intervention components, that we can then perhaps cost out, if we just include these certain aspects or use these certain delivery modes, what would that look like? But we are gathering information from trials as we come along around the studies that do have cost data available, so that we can try to understand that, even if it's a subset of studies.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a question here which is a point of clarification. Can you please clarify when the individual studies would have been peer reviewed? And of course, all of these are studies that are peer reviewed, but maybe one of you could just go into more detail about when these data come to you and when they get published in relation to the publication of the original paper.
Yes, so in a prospective meta-analysis, traditionally we would wait for individual studies to publish their own results before we then publish the prospective meta-analysis results. So for each study that wants to publish their own results, they would get that opportunity and go through peer review as normal. They wouldn't be peer reviewed at the time point we include them because they're not completed yet. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
So, but the issue, Lena, is that you don't publish somebody's results before they have actually.
Oh no, so we don't, certainly not. With COVID,
you may have access to the data and use your own hidden analyses, anticipating that they're going to get published.
Yes, so what we would do originally, we would actually wait for trials to publish before we even would ask for their data. But recently we've had quite a few trialists for other projects where we would further on in the data collection that actually proposed to give us their data whilst their publication is still under review. And in these cases, we would have explicit written agreements with them to not publish any of their results until they have published themselves. Because we are aware, we all live in an academic world where we need to publish our results, and we wouldn't want to take that away from any individual trial. So usually we get the trials to publish and then we publish the summary results.
Thank you. It really highlights the importance of trust and the relationships that you establish with the individual trialists. Exactly. We have a question here. I don't know whether this might be Kylie or one of the others, about the role of your consumer representatives in the study.
I can talk briefly about that, and then others can add to it if they like. So essentially, we're just wanting to check in with them. So we've had a few Zoom meetings to make sure that we are actually asking the right questions, we're collecting the right data. Is there anything that we're missing? That type of thing, really. Yeah, so it was interesting actually to talk to them because they sort of pointed out a few different subgroups that we hadn't initially considered to add.
Could you give some examples, or any of you give some examples of that?
I guess just from my own experience with some of the questions around the target behaviours, it was really interesting to hear what they sort of thought about the target behaviours that we're trying to achieve in these interventions, and that actually they seemed quite sort of upper class strategies around sort of providing healthy foods and physical activity opportunities and things like that. And I think that really shows that we do need to be aware of how we're providing information and strategies, and not just, you know, putting forward information to people in these interventions, but really practical ways and looking at those different types of interventions that might support some of the bigger systemic barriers that certain population groups might be dealing with as well. So our consumer parent representative is quite heavily involved in the sort of foster care section and working with some really disadvantaged families. So there were a lot of other items that they came up with that might be useful subgroups to look at that, unfortunately, I think with the data available and the people that generally volunteer to take part in these trials, we might not be able to address all of those, but it's definitely highlighted a couple of other subgroups that we might not have thought about that we're looking to include in our analyses as well.
Maybe just to add to that, the way we deal with consumer involvement is we really try to invite our consumers to be co-investigators. So we've invited them very early on. They've been involved in the protocol conceptualization, and we have very frequent meetings with them. And they're also part of our advisory group to really get them, to not just have them there somewhere in the background so we can say we had consumer involvement, but instead to really, so that they see themselves as co-investigator and have proper meaningful input.
One of the issues, so there's a couple of follow-on questions that are coming up a little bit. One of these, I think Karen Campbell's raised the issue about the original PMA of EPOCH was that the background level of health service support was an important predictor of opportunity to show effect. And I think this also relates potentially to issues to do with barriers or not that may be outside the environment. How do you, are you able to assess any of these if you're bringing things from different countries that have different levels of support available to, for new pet families? Are you thinking about this, and how are you dealing with it?
Yes, it's certainly something we're thinking about, and I think we will be able to look at this in a lot more detail because we have so many more countries and levels of background care. So it's something we're very interested in as one of the subgroups we have pre-specified. And I think it'll be really interesting to see whether these interventions work differently across different contexts and countries.
That relates, there's an issue here too, going back to the issue about including data before they get published. What happens if the study ends up being unpublishable, say it's found to have flaws? What do you do with those data? Would they be excluded, therefore?
I mean, it depends on why the study is unpublishable. We would have, as in any meta-analysis, we would have pre-specified eligibility criteria, and certain flaws in a study would preclude the study from being included. So if there are serious flaws with randomization, for example, and our eligibility criteria is a randomized controlled trial, we would not be able to include that study. However, if it's only that the study maybe didn't reach their recruitment target, so it just had a low sample size or wasn't effective and the investigators struggled to publish, that's actually something we're particularly interested in because that helps us prevent publication bias. So those studies we would still include. We have actually in previous projects had some investigators that said, you can have our data, we're not planning on publishing it, so feel free to use it for your prospective meta-analysis. So again, a lot of communication and looking at pre-specified eligibility criteria.
Just for folk who don't know, Lena and others have also worked, for example, in neonatal and other trials. So not in this specific area, but they've worked in PMAs with other trials where that's been the case. Clearly, a lot of thought needs to go into these issues. There's a question here about what percentage of the trials in Top Child include underserved or low-income populations at high risk of obesity, because these vary. Just to let people know, for example, the original 4 EPOCH trials, one of them was in a more socially disadvantaged region of one city in Australia, and but the others were a little bit more, in inverted commas, middle class. So I don't know, Kylie or others, if you've got any of the ones that have agreed in principle, how many of those are in underserved regions of a particular country or underserved or more socially disadvantaged populations?
So we haven't actually looked at this closely yet, other than just looking at the map, so the different recruitment countries. But interestingly, there is one trial in Guatemala which has dual focus. So it aims to prevent obesity, but it also aims to prevent undernutrition, which is a big issue there as well. So we need to sort of carefully think about how we'll incorporate these into our analyses. But yeah, we will be looking closely at different socioeconomic positions as a very
again,
subgroup.
That's a really great advantage, again, of having the individual participant data, because we can't only look across studies, we can look within studies, what are the differences in their populations, and look at socioeconomic differences within studies to look at whether there are differences, how interventions work, and what type of interventions are effective. So that's one of the big reasons why we feel individual participant data is so important here.
Folk, one of the questions from Andrew Milat basically asks, are you using any strategy to categorise implementation strategies used in trials? It's often unclear from peer-reviewed papers. I'm not sure if Andrew's talking about, because the trials that you will include will tend to be what I understand as efficacy trials, which are, you know, somewhat more scientifically rigorous than effectiveness or you know, implementation trials, which are real world trials.
I can speak to that, Louise. So I think quite similar to the cost effectiveness, it's another thing that we're really interested in looking into more. So if there's anyone online looking to do a PhD, we have some ideas of how we'd actually look at the scalability of these interventions and use some of the tools available to understand those. But similar in the cost effectiveness, that we're looking to understand which of those trials might have gone on to be implemented or sort of scaled up, and see what we can learn from those subgroups of studies as well.
There is a comment about the Australia specific trials. So those have been published, or those to date have been done. And if people want to go and look at those, that was published in Pediatric Obesity. I'm just speaking as one of the co-authors on that study. I'm not sure as yet. They were generalist rather than individual specific subpopulation specific groups, and the understanding about how they would be worked, you know, how they would be used in Aboriginal populations is still being worked through. I know some of the individual trials are currently going through the process in implementation, looking at specific subgroups and including looking at Indigenous populations, but it's somewhat early to comment on those issues as yet. So, I mean, there's a whole different way of whole range of strategies that you can use to try to get a sense of which groups this may work in or not. I don't know if one of you wanted to comment specifically about that in any more detail.
I think just to sort of reiterate what Lena was saying about the benefits of individual participant data, that we can actually look if trials have collected whether participants identified as Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander or Indigenous populations in different countries as well. That might be something we can explore if there's enough participants when we start pulling together some of these trials to understand those. But yeah, it's definitely, I think, a gap that might sort of continue or be a follow-on project as more trials become available, or where we might tailor future interventions.
Okay, but we're right at the end of our time just now, and there are still some unanswered questions. I encourage you folk to go and to the Top Child Collaboration website and to the Early Prevention of Obesity in Childhood CRE website, because there is information there. If you look at, you know, there's also been studies that have been published by Lena and Brittany and others, and you would again get more information from those. I want to thank our three presenters, Brittany Johnson, Lena Seidler and Kylie Hunter, for their superb presentation, and for all of you for asking really great questions and for participating in this. Again, good morning, good afternoon and good evening to everybody. Thank you for joining. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, guys. Good to see you, Kylie.